As we commemorate the 25th anniversary of the assassination of John Kennedy, the question that many times is asked, many people across this country, I must ask you, where were you the day that Kennedy was shot?
I was the Los Angeles bureau chief for Life magazine. I heard it. Someone shouted to me from the AP ticker, and within 45 minutes I was on a plane to Dallas. And I arrived in Dallas at about the same time that Air Force One took off with the newly sworn-in president and the president's body.
What was your assignment in Dallas?
We didn't have time even to think about that. I called New York and they said go, and I went with a well-known, later well-known author named Tommy Thompson, who wrote best-selling books. He was a colleague of mine in the bureau. He went off to try to find the Oswald family, which he did, and got quite an exclusive story. I went into town to try to figure out something, what the hell to do about this. We didn't know what Dallas was going to be like. We'd heard flying in that a cop had been shot and that there was a suspect in custody. So we landed there, began dispatching other reporters and photographers that were coming in, and before nightfall, I knew what my assignment was going to be.
We'll talk about that assignment in just a few minutes, but tell me first where you were and what you thought of when you first heard of Lee Harvey Oswald and his possible participation in Kennedy's death.
Well, of course, nobody knew who Lee Harvey Oswald was. We knew that he had been captured in a theater. I guess the one thing that probably all journalists at the time were struck by was he had been indicted, convicted, and almost sentenced by the time we got on the ground. There seemed to be no doubt in the Dallas police mind and in the prosecutor's mind that they had the guy. And I was a little shocked by this, by what seemed to be like a kind of total disregard of his constitutional rights.
That night, you got a telephone call that has visually capped the assassination of John Kennedy for the rest of Americans, for the rest of our lives. Tell us a little bit about that phone call and what happened afterwards.
Well, I knew what my assignment was going to be. A stringer, a part-time correspondent for Life, called me from police headquarters to say that she had just heard from a cop that a full filmed record of the assassination had been taken by a garment manufacturer who happened to go out there with his home movie camera. And she said his name began with a Z, and she thought it was something like Zapruder. And I thought, what do I do? So I picked up the telephone book, and damned if he wasn't there. Zapruder, Abraham. And I began calling about 5 o'clock. Called every 15 minutes until almost 11. And finally, he answered the phone, or a weary voice answered the phone. I determined that it was Mr. Zapruder, that he indeed had taken the assassination, that he had caught it from beginning to end, that it had been processed, he'd looked at it, and no, I could not come out at that moment and look at it. I asked him, I pleaded with him. I knew this was something that Life magazine had to have. And, but he said he'd been out riding around in the countryside for several hours. He was so disturbed, distraught by what had happened and what he'd seen through his viewfinder. So I lay off and saw the film for the first time early the next morning, at the same time that the Secret Service saw it.
Explain that experience for us. What was that like for you?
It was probably the single most dramatic moment I've ever encountered as a journalist. I got there even earlier than he said to get there, which is, for young journalism students, remember that. They tell you to be there at 9, get there at 8. And he let me come in with Secret Service agents who were seeing for the first time their catastrophic failure to protect the president. There's no sound, of course, so you supply the sound in your own mind. And he put this film on this rickety old 8mm projector. That was all you could hear, was the hum of that thing, and suddenly, and it's over in about 10 seconds. And you see the motorcade snaking around Dealey Plaza, crowds waving, the president waving back. Suddenly, his two hands go up to his throat in that famous gesture. But the motorcade passes behind a highway sign about 2 seconds after it emerges. Then you can see Connally going down with a look of agony on his face, Kennedy beginning to slumped to one side, and then comes the horrifying frame where he is hit in the head. Famous frame 313 in that film. And we all know that Mrs. Kennedy, at that point, why no one, either out of panic or in an effort to get help, saw what had happened, and literally her husband's brains were in her lap. She climbed out of the back seat and began crawling along the trunk of the car, and at that point a courageous Secret Service agent named Clint Hill jumped off the Queen Mary, which is the big car carrying Secret Service agents, jumped up on the back of the presidential limousine and pushed and coaxed Mrs. Kennedy back into the seat, and at that moment they took off for Parkland Hospital with the mortally wounded president.
After seeing that film, was it difficult to keep your, any personal emotions out of the journalistic duty that you had then to secure that film?
It probably would be wise of me to say that I was overwhelmed by the tragedy. I must say, those 4 days in Dallas were so peculiar, so weird. Dallas was such a bizarre city during that period. The government was in total disarray. No one walked on the streets. The stores were closed. The city was full of journalists competing savagely for that part of the story that existed in Texas. And all I could think of, quite frankly, when I saw that film was, we have got to have this for Life magazine.
How did you negotiate it?
Well, by the time I saw the film, other journalists had learned the same thing and began pounding on the door of this little room where Zapruder was showing us the film. And he finally came out and they all said, we want to see the film. He showed them the film. He said, but this fellow, and he pointed to me, he said, was the first one to contact me, so I'm going to talk to him first. Well, the chorus of wails that came up from the other journalists, and they said, Mr. Zapruder, make no deal. Please talk to us before you make a deal. So we went into his little private office, very shabby office, and I knew that if I didn't sew up that film, in the few moments that I had in that office alone, that those wolves outside the door were going to get it. I'm being flip. It was a very emotional time, and but I also, we had to have it. So we talked and negotiated, and he wanted Life magazine to have it. He didn't want the film to be exploited. He told me that he'd had a nightmare the night that he'd shot the film. He'd been walking through Times Square in this nightmare, and someone came out of one of those sleazy theaters and began saying, come on in and watch the president get killed on the big screen. And he woke up shuddering, and he said, I can't let that happen. And he said, I said, Life magazine won't do that to this film. You know that, Mr. Zapruder. He said, yes, I do. And in the end, it was Life's reputation, I think more than any persuasion that I was able to summon, that got us the film.
How much did you pay him for the film?
At that moment, we paid $50,000 for print rights only. Now, that seems like it was a lot of money then, and it still is, but I know my competitors would have gone above that. I came back 2 days later, and next day, really, and we then obtained all rights to the Zapruder film, that is theatrical and television, whatever, for a total of $150,000 paid in 6 installments. $25,000 each.
Frame 313, was it in Life magazine the following week?
No. One of the reasons that we wanted to get that film, quite frankly, was we felt we wanted to prevent exploitation. And we did not run that particular frame of the awful head wound until several weeks later.
You did, however, I think in the next week, show the picture of Lyndon Johnson being sworn in as the next President of the United States. An interesting photo, many people have seen many times. It appears to be a very small airplane cabin. Talk a little bit about the access of Life magazine outside of Dallas right after the assassination.
Well, that's the picture there. That's Air Force One, and Air Force One was then a 707, which is a pretty small airplane as we think of them now. I think because of Life's coverage of the Kennedy family, Teddy Kennedy once referred to Life magazine as the sort of the family scrapbook, and it's true that that Life was able to get into places that that other photographers were not.